Have you ever believed that a silent child and a forgotten dog could expose the monster hidden behind the finest mask? In the small town of Willow Creek, where the wind carries old prayers and broken dreams, a 5-year-old girl clutched a fraying leash, and a golden retriever with a scarred past heard the whisper no one else could. One look, one silent signal, one heart unbroken. This is the story of Lily Cooper, and how love, even when unspoken, can roar louder than fear itself. Stay with us for the miracle that silenced a courtroom and awakened a forgotten town. The town of Willow Creek, cradled by the sprawling hills of Montana, stirred awake beneath a heavy pewter sky. The air was laced with the scent of damp earth after a night of soft rain, and a silver mist curled low along the sidewalks, clinging to storefronts and old lampposts like forgotten dreams. It was a morning when the world seemed to hold its breath. Every sound muffled, every movement hesitant, as if nature itself anticipated the reckoning to come. At the town's center, the Fairhaven courthouse stood resolute, its time-worn stone facade streaked with rain and history, a somber sentinel against the encroaching cold. Inside the courtroom was already packed, a sea of muted faces pressed into the polished pews, their collective gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors at the far end. The buzz of hushed conversations had faded into a waiting silence, thick and fragile. Overhead, the stained glass windows filtered the ashen light into pale fragments that floated down like fallen prayers. When the doors groaned open on reluctant hinges, the room seemed to tilt forward as one. A figure small and impossibly vulnerable crossed the threshold. Lily Carter, just 5 years old, entered with a hesitant step. Her tiny fingers curled tightly around a frayed leash. Her hair was a soft halo of wheat gold waves framing a pale, heart-shaped face dominated by wide blue eyes that seemed too knowing for someone so young. Dressed in a pale blue dress beneath a cream cardigan, she looked like a breath of color against the courthouse's somber tones. At her side moved Cooper, a golden retriever, whose golden coat shimmered faintly under the muted light. 7 years old, with a build sturdy yet graceful, Cooper carried himself with a serene confidence, the kind born of a life spent in service of others. A faint scar ran beneath his right ear, a hidden testament to battles fought and survived. His deep amber eyes held a patient, unwavering gaze, as if he alone could see the fragile line between courage and collapse, and was determined to anchor it steady. Behind them followed Hannah Carter, Lily's mother, a woman in her early 30s, who bore the exhaustion of endless worry like a second skin, tall and slender with auburn hair pulled into a practical knot. Hannah's brown eyes flickered constantly around the room, sharp with protective instinct. Her simple navy jacket and worn jeans spoke of a life where comfort and readiness outweighed fashion. A life narrowed to the singular focus of keeping her daughter safe. The judge presiding was Nathaniel Morgan, a towering figure who seemed carved from the same stone as the courthouse itself. At 65, his thick silver hair and deeply lined face gave him the air of an ancient oak, immovable, weathered, and wise. His steel-gray eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, watched Lily's approach with a gravity that rarely softened in this room. In his decades on the bench, he had seen countless proceedings, but something in the child's solemn demeanor caused a faint tightening around his mouth, a quiet ache for the innocence that had been so clearly stolen. Moving quietly behind Lily and Hannah was Meredith King, the court-appointed guardian ad litem. In her late 40s, with short-cropped gray hair and an aura of calm authority, Meredith wore charcoal slacks and a simple blazer, her posture upright yet unthreatening. She had spent 2 decades walking children like Lily into rooms filled with strangers and judgment, and though each case etched another line into her heart, she carried her burden with quiet pride. The room watched in breathless silence as Lily made her way toward the witness stand. Her steps were small and uncertain, but Cooper's steady presence at her side seemed to lend her a fragile strength. Every polished step echoed too loudly. The leash clutched in her hands, trembling slightly. Judge Morgan's voice, when it came, was softer than expected, worn and careful. "Miss Carter," he said, addressing her with the solemn respect reserved for warriors and kings. "You are safe here. Take your time." The ancient clock mounted high on the wall ticked away the seconds. Each beat a solemn drum in the vast expectant chamber. Meredith gently guided Lily to the witness stand, lifting her onto the cushioned seat. Her legs, clad in white tights and scuffed black shoes, dangled high above the wooden floor. Cooper sat at her feet, curling neatly into a watchful position, his tail lying still across the marble. No one spoke. No one dared disturb the delicate web of silence that stretched across the room. The people of Willow Creek, who had come perhaps out of morbid curiosity, found themselves caught instead in a moment that demanded reverence. It was not the spectacle they had expected. It was something far more unsettling, the quiet, brutal dignity of a child stepping into a storm, not of her own making. Across the room, Hannah Carter remained standing just behind the bar, her fingers twisted in the hem of her jacket, her eyes never leaving her daughter. She looked like a woman caught between two impossible desires to rush forward and scoop her child into her arms, or to let her fight this battle on her own terms. Judge Morgan leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. He exchanged a glance with Meredith King, who offered the barest nod. The judge's voice was steady but not impatient as he continued, careful not to startle the delicate equilibrium. "There is no need to speak if you do not wish to," he said. "Sometimes a simple gesture can speak louder than words." Still, Lily did not move. Her fingers toyed absently with the leash, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the judge's bench, as if she were looking for something only she could see. Cooper, sensing her hesitation, remained utterly still, his amber gaze fixed forward, a sentinel forged of patience and quiet love. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, but no verdict would come today. No confession would tear free, no righteous gavel would yet fall. For now, there was only a room full of strangers bearing witness to the immense courage it took for a small girl to simply exist in the place where she had once lost everything. Outside, the mist thickened, pressing against the courthouse windows, turning the world beyond into a gray blur. Inside, time stretched thin, a single fragile thread, trembling between past and future. And so, on that heavy autumn morning in Willow Creek, the battle for truth and healing began. Not with fire, not with fury, but with a little girl, her steadfast dog, and a silence that demanded the world listen. The mist outside the courthouse thickened, curling against the old glass like ghostly fingers, obscuring the view of the familiar world beyond. Inside the courtroom, the hush deepened, as if the very walls leaned closer to listen. Judge Nathaniel Morgan, seated high upon his bench, tapped his pen lightly against his ledger, the tiny sound impossibly loud in the taut silence. His steel-gray eyes studied Lily Carter, a 5-year-old whose very stillness seemed to speak volumes that words never could. Lily sat atop the cushioned witness chair, her tiny body dwarfed by the vast expanse of polished oak. Her pale blue dress fluttered slightly with each shallow breath she took, and the frayed leash in her hand trembled just the faintest bit. Beside her, Cooper lay with the stillness of an ancient guardian, his golden fur gleaming dully under the courthouse's somber lighting. His deep amber eyes remained locked forward, unwavering, a statue of patience and quiet vigilance. From a side table, Jenna Collins, the prosecutor, shifted slightly. A woman of sharp lines and sharper instincts, Jenna wore her professionalism like armor. Today, her navy suit was crisp, her brown hair pulled back into a severe knot at the base of her neck. Her dark eyes flickered between the judge, the child, and the seated audience, reading every subtle movement. She knew something was building, could feel it in the charge of the air. Meredith King, the court-appointed guardian, knelt quietly near Lily, offering the girl the unspoken comfort of presence. Meredith's plain charcoal blazer and low-heeled shoes seemed to absorb the heavy light, her short gray hair framing a face carved with lines of empathy and tempered strength. Her green eyes, however, remained fixed not on the child, but on the subtle shift in the room's energy. A low cough broke the silence, a nervous tick from one of the townsfolk seated in the back rows. The noise seemed to give permission for a collective, shuffling shoes scraped faintly against the wooden floor. Coats were pulled tighter against the lingering cold. No one wanted to be the first to move, yet none could look away from the quiet drama unfolding before them. The heavy door at the side of the room swung open with a soft creak, and in strode defense attorney Vincent Hale, leading his client into view. Vincent, a man thick in build and heavy in presence, wore his usual pinstripe suit now crumpled at the collar from the morning's rain. His round glasses slid slightly down his nose as he guided his client to the defense table. Derek Whitmore followed with the poise of a man used to being watched. In his early 40s, he wore a charcoal gray suit that fitted his tall, lean frame impeccably. His blonde hair was combed neatly, the part precise enough to suggest the work of a mirror and many minutes of preparation. His features were sharp. A strong jaw, a straight nose, and pale blue eyes that rarely betrayed thought or emotion. Only a slight tension in his mouth and almost imperceptible rigidity at the corners of his eyes suggested anything but calm. He took his seat at the defense table without looking directly at Lily, but the room noticed the faint flicker of hesitation in his stride as if crossing some unseen threshold. Jenna Collins rose gracefully from her chair. She approached the stand slowly, careful not to tower over the small figure seated there. She spoke in a voice woven with softness and certainty. Lily, Jenna said gently, "I know you have been very brave to come here today. You don't need to speak if you don't want to. You can use your hand or any signal you like if you feel ready." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath once more. Lily shifted slightly in her seat, the leash pulling tighter around her tiny fingers. Her blue eyes, too old for 5'2", hollow, moved for the first time, slowly turning toward the defense table. Across the distance, Cooper's ears pricked forward. For a long, heartbeat-stretched moment, nothing happened. Then, Lily's hand, small and pale, tightened imperceptibly around the leash. Cooper responded at once. His muscles stiffened beneath his golden coat. His breathing slowed into a deliberate, deep rhythm. His great head lifted slightly, eyes narrowing not in aggression, but in focus, in recognition. From his seat at the defense table, Derek Whitmore shifted ever so slightly. It was a movement so small most would miss it the slightest tensing of shoulders, a shallow inhale that pulled taut the fabric of his suit across his ribs. But Jenna Collins saw it. So did Judge Morgan. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Cooper's gaze locked onto Derek Whitmore with a sudden, silent intensity. The dog's massive body remained still, but the air around him seemed to hum with contained energy like a storm crouched on the horizon. Vincent Hale leaned over to whisper something to his client, a frown creasing his round, ruddy face. Derek nodded almost mechanically, his eyes never meeting the little girl's. Judge Morgan steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his gray eyes narrowing further. He had seen many kinds of reactions in this room. Rage, grief, denial, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this one. This wasn't fear of judgment. It was the fear of being recognized, seen for what one truly was. In the gallery, Hannah Carter clenched the fabric of her jacket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her body was rigid with the effort not to run forward, not to snatch her daughter away from the weight of so many gazes. Outside, the mist pressed harder against the windows, casting the room into an even gloomier pall. Lily remained motionless, her body stiff with contained emotion. Only the faintest tremble betrayed her. But Cooper, loyal. Cooper had spoken for her in the only way he could. No growl, no bark, only a presence sharpened into something too pure, too real to ignore. And in that charged, suffocating silence, the first crack splintered the perfect illusion that had held the courtroom in its grip. The truth, once dormant, had begun to stir. Outside the courthouse, the mist had thickened into a damp veil that swallowed the streets of Willow Creek. The courthouse stood like a lone monolith in a town muffled by expectation and rumor. Inside the courtroom had sunk into a silence so deep it seemed sacrilegious to break it. Cooper's alertness, the tension radiating from his golden form, had unsettled everyone. Yet the formalities of the court demanded patience, and Judge Nathaniel Morgan, ever the guardian of order, declared a short recess, as the courtroom slowly emptied. Whispers swirled like eddies of smoke, and Hannah Carter gently guided Lily away from the stand, the child's fingers still tangled in the frayed leash. Meredith King remained close, her eyes sharp, her posture a wall of quiet vigilance against the crowd's hungry curiosity. Beyond the courthouse, in a squat, unassuming building at the edge of town that served as the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department, two figures pored over a spread of files and maps under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights. Sheriff Mark Ramsey, a man carved out of grit and duty, leaned heavily over the table, one large hand splayed across a wrinkled map dotted with red thumbtacks. Mark was in his early 50s, tall and thick-set, with broad shoulders that seemed burdened not just by age, but by the weight of every unsolved case he carried. His brown hair was streaked with gray, usually hidden beneath a weathered Stetson, and his craggy face bore the deep lines of sleepless nights and promises made to grieving families. Beside him stood Special Agent Claire Simmons, a study in contrast. Claire was in her late 30s, slim and athletic, with sharply cut chestnut hair that brushed the collar of her black field jacket. Her green eyes were intense, restless, as if always calculating the next move, the next angle. She carried herself with the coiled energy of someone who had seen too much, too young, and had sworn never to be caught off guard again. Years ago, Claire's younger sister had disappeared without a trace, a wound that had driven her to the FBI and had never fully healed. Her manner was brisk, her words clipped, but beneath the armor was a heart that burned cold with determination. Sheriff Ramsey sighed heavily, tapping a thick finger on a cluster of pins surrounding Willow Creek. 3 disappearances. He muttered, his voice roughened by too many cigarettes and too little sleep. 18 months. No witnesses, no leads that stuck. Claire's eyes flicked from file to file, her mind stitching together invisible threads. And now, she said, her voice low, we have Lily Carter, a survivor. Mark nodded grimly. Something about that man. His words trailed off. He didn't need to finish. They both knew who he meant. The files spread before them contained photographs of 3 children, each staring back with the wide-eyed innocence that only made their absence more unbearable. Each child had vanished near Willow Creek under eerily similar circumstances. No signs of forced entry, no cries for help, heard no obvious struggle. The pattern was there for those willing to see it, but until Lily, there had been no survivor, no voice, even a silent one, to point a finger. Claire pulled a photo from one of the folders, laying it beside the others. Ethan Miles, 7 years old, disappeared, leaving a birthday party. No witnesses. She pointed to another, Sophie Jenkins, 6 years old. Last seen playing in her front yard, her ball was found 3 blocks away. She placed a third photo down. Maya Torres, 5 years old, vanished walking home from school. No clues. Mark's jaw tightened. And every damn time Derek Whitmore was nearby, community events, software workshops for kids, volunteer at the library. Always there. Always invisible. Claire's fingers drummed once against the table before stilling. But proximity isn't proof. We need more. Mark pulled a manila envelope from under the pile and slid it across to her. Inside were copies of old police interviews, background checks, and crucially a series of maintenance work orders linked to properties in the outskirts of Willow Creek. Derek's side business. Mark said grimly, home security installations, private contracts. No oversight. Claire's lips thinned into a grim line. Access to homes. Access to families to children. Her voice was a whisper, now heavy with the horror they both understood. A sharp knock interrupted them. Deputy Simon Brooks, a young man barely out of his 20s, poked his head in. Simon was earnest, sandy-haired, and still wore the naive hope that the world could be saved if you just tried hard enough. His cheeks flushed pink as he held up a flash drive. Agent Simmons, Simon said, voice a little too loud. The digital records you requested. Surveillance footage from the town center 3 months ago. Claire accepted the drive with a nod, her expression unreadable. Good work, Deputy. As Simon ducked out, Mark gave Claire a sideways glance. Kid reminds me of me, he said gruffly, and Claire almost smiled. Almost Claire plugged the drive into her laptop, and together they leaned over the screen. Grainy footage appeared a sunny afternoon townsfolk milling about children darting between market stalls. They fast-forwarded through hours of nothing until Claire's finger froze above the trackpad. There, she whispered. The footage showed a man in a crisp polo shirt and khakis. Derek Whitmore, lingering near a group of children gathered around a street performer. His body language was casual, unremarkable, but his eyes tracked one little girl with unsettling precision. Lily Carter, clutching a bright pink balloon, unaware of the predator's gaze. Claire and Mark exchanged a look, the unspoken certainty crackling between them. Claire clicked save. We have our starting point, she said, voice low and fierce. This time he won't slip away. Mark grunted in agreement. No more missed chances. Outside, the mist thickened into rain, cold and unrelenting. And inside the sheriff's office a storm had begun to form, one that would not stop until every secret buried in Willow Creek was unearthed. The rain had thickened into a steady, sorrowful drizzle by the time the courthouse reconvened. Inside the solemn walls, where the air still carried the weight of unspoken truths, Lily Carter sat quietly, her small frame nestled against the warm bulk of Cooper. While the courtroom bustled faintly with the slow, careful movements of officials and murmured conversations, Lily's hand found its familiar resting place in Cooper's fur, grounding herself in his steady presence. To the casual observer, Cooper was simply a handsome golden retriever 7 years old, with a coat of rich honey gold and eyes like warm amber. But for those who looked closer, there were stories written in the faint scars beneath his right ear, in the slight stiffness that occasionally marred his otherwise fluid gait, and in the way he watched the world with a solemnity far older than his years. Cooper had not always belonged to Lily. Long before he found himself sitting in the middle of a courtroom beside a broken child, Cooper had once worn a different kind of collar, a badge of service and sacrifice. Born into a prestigious K-9 program in Texas, Cooper had been trained from puppyhood for therapy and support roles with military veterans suffering from PTSD. His handlers quickly realized he was a special patient to the point of saintliness, perceptive in ways that no amount of training could teach. He worked at Fort Ridge, a sprawling Army rehabilitation center nestled at the edge of the desert, where the dry heat painted everything in faded hues, and where the wounds carried by the soldiers were often invisible, but no less fatal. His primary handler had been Sergeant Mason Laird, a grizzled veteran with a broad chest, a salt-and-pepper beard, and a prosthetic left leg. Mason was a man who spoke little but understood everything worth knowing. He was in his early 50s, with deep laugh lines bracketing his mouth and dark eyes shadowed by things he rarely named Mason, and Cooper had been a team for 2 years, walking wounded men and women back into the realm of the living one, a slow day at a time. But life, as always, had other plans. One evening, a patient suffering a particularly violent flashback lashed out in panic. In the chaos, a heavy metal IV stand was thrown, and Cooper, lunging to protect a nurse, was struck hard along his side and shoulder. The injury left permanent damage to his mobility, subtle, but enough that he could no longer meet the stringent demands of his therapy certification bureaucracy, moved with clinical detachment. Cooper was classified as unfit for service, and Mason, torn between duty and heartbreak, was forced to sign the papers. Cooper was retired. The shelter Cooper ended up in was modest and overburdened, a pale blue building on the outskirts of Fort Ridge, where the scent of disinfectant battled with the ever-present tang of despair. Most adopters wanted young, sprightly dogs without issues. Cooper waited. Days stretched into weeks, weeks blurred into months, until a woman from Willow Creek appeared carrying more sorrow than she could hide behind her warm smile. Hannah Carter had come south on the desperate advice of a grief counselor, chasing a story she had barely dared hope could be true, that sometimes a wounded soul could heal another 32 years old. At the time, Hannah bore the delicate, stretched, thin beauty of someone held together more by stubbornness than strength. Her auburn hair was often pulled back hastily, her brown eyes rimmed by sleepless nights, and her slender frame seemed fragile but never faltering. The counselor's words echoed in her mind as she stepped into the shelter. Find someone who understands brokenness without needing it, explained. It took Hannah less than a minute to find Cooper. He had sat quietly in the far corner of the kennel away from the barking chaos, his eyes meeting hers with a gaze that saw everything she was trying so hard to hold inside. She approached cautiously, her palms open, her voice low. Cooper did not bark. He did not lunge forward with desperate need. He merely waited, tail giving a tentative thump against the concrete floor. When Hannah dropped to her knees in front of him, her jacket soaking through with the water from the floor, Cooper simply pressed his broad head into her chest and exhaled as if releasing something he too had carried for too long. She signed the adoption papers that afternoon. The drive back to Willow Creek was long and winding, stretching over gray highways that disappeared into the mist. Hannah spoke little, her hand resting occasionally on Cooper's massive head, feeling his slow, steady breathing like a metronome of resilience. Lily had been silent for nearly 3 months by the time Cooper entered their lives. The house, once filled with her giggles and songs, had become a mausoleum of echoes. Hannah had tried everything: therapy, art classes, animal-assisted programs. Nothing had cracked the wall Lily had built around herself. Cooper didn't try to climb over that wall. He simply lay beside it. On the first day, Lily refused to touch him. She sat rigid on the couch while Cooper lay curled at her feet. His presence a quiet offer with no expectation. On the second day, Lily moved an inch closer, her tiny toes brushing against his fur. Cooper didn't move. On the third night, after another jagged nightmare had torn Lily from sleep, Hannah found her daughter curled against Cooper's side in the living room, fast asleep, her small hand tangled in his golden coat. For the first time in months, Lily had slept through the night. From that point on, Cooper became more than just a dog. He was a lifeline, an anchor. When Lily needed to go outside but couldn't face the open sky, Cooper walked beside her. When strangers' voices overwhelmed her, Cooper would sit solidly between her and the world until she could breathe again. In therapy sessions, when the words refused to come, Lily learned to signal through Cooper a squeeze of his ear, for fear a tap against his shoulder for sadness. They had invented a language of their own, stitched together with silent trust. And so, on the day of the hearing when Hannah led Lily into the courthouse, she had done so, knowing that whatever lay ahead, her daughter would not be facing it alone. She had Cooper, the forgotten soldier with the patient eyes, and the broken body, who had once been deemed too damaged to be of use. But healing Hannah had learned rarely came in straight lines or perfect packages. Sometimes it came wrapped in golden fur, carried on sturdy paws, and guarded by a heart that refused to give up. And in that courtroom under the cold light and wary gazes, Cooper waited not for orders, not for approval, but for the silent signal from the child who had once needed saving, and who had in turn saved him. Night in Willow Creek fell like a heavy quilt, thick and unmoving. The rain that had persisted throughout the day gave way to a damp stillness, the streets gleaming under the faint uneven glow of street lamps. At the edge of town, nestled between a grove of skeletal birch trees, stood the Carter house, small, modest, and quiet as a held breath. Inside, the rooms bore the careful neatness of a life reconstructed piece by fragile piece, where each object seemed placed not for beauty, but for reassurance, as if to whisper, "You are safe here." Lily Carter lay curled on the worn living room couch, the old patchwork quilt pulled up to her chin. Across the room, the embers in the fireplace crackled softly, throwing long dancing shadows onto the walls. Cooper, faithful as ever, was sprawled beside the couch, his golden coat catching the firelight in molten waves. His breathing was slow, even a steady counterpoint to the rapid, shallow breaths that fluttered in Lily's chest. Some nights were easier than others. Tonight was not. The nightmares had not come in screams nor in thrashing terror. They came in the silence, the sudden suffocating stillness that wrapped around Lily's small form and squeezed until even breathing became an effort. Hannah Carter, sitting in the adjoining kitchen at the scarred oak table, watched her daughter with wary eyes, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug. She wore an oversized cardigan, her auburn hair twisted into a loose knot, and her face, though lovely, was drawn with exhaustion and a kind of helplessness that no mother should have to endure. In the glow of the fire, Lily's hand slipped free of the quilt, reaching hesitantly downward until her fingertips brushed against the warm fur of Cooper's side. The dog stirred slightly, lifting his great head to peer at her with ancient, patient eyes. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then Lily tapped her fingers lightly against his shoulder. 3 quick beats. Cooper's tail gave a faint answering thump against the hardwood floor. It was the beginning. The first night Lily had managed the signal, it had been a fluke, an instinctive reach into the darkness for reassurance. But Cooper, in his infinite deliberate wisdom, had understood, and from that night forward the signals evolved. 3 taps on his shoulder meant, "I'm scared." A squeeze behind his ear meant, "I need you closer." 2 soft strokes along his back meant, "I'm okay now." No one had taught Lily this language, no therapist, no teacher. It was a language built not with rules, but with trust, with the unspoken bond between 2 souls who had both known what it was to be left alone in the dark. Hannah noticed the change almost immediately. In the mornings after these silent conversations, Lily seemed lighter, her steps less hesitant, her shoulders less curled inward, as if expecting blows from the unseen. Though Lily still refused to speak, the veil between her and the world had thinned just a little more each day. At Hannah's gentle suggestion, they began working with a private therapist in Willow Creek, a woman named Dr. Margaret Hale, who specialized in nonverbal communication therapy. Dr. Hale was in her late 40s, tall and reed-thin, with short-cropped silver hair and a wardrobe of colorful scarves that brightened her otherwise sensible suits. Her voice was soft but firm, and she carried herself with the calm of someone who had weathered her own storms long ago. It was said around town that Dr. Hale had lost her only son to a drowning accident years earlier, a wound that had never closed, but had instead driven her to reach into the silence of other grieving children. At their first session, Dr. Hale had not attempted to force Lily into conversation. Instead, she placed a shallow dish of water, a basket of smooth stones, and a length of soft cloth on the floor between them. She invited Lily to touch, to move, to signal. Cooper was allowed to remain curled protectively at Lily's side, his presence a silent reassurance that no one would demand more than she could give week by week, signal by signal. Lily's world expanded. A brush of fingers through water meant, "I remember." A stone placed at the edge of the cloth meant, "I'm afraid." Sometimes Lily would tap Cooper with patterns. Only he seemed to understand, and the dog would respond with a shift of his body, a low, steady breath, a small nudge of his nose. Dr. Hale documented these interactions with a quiet diligence, often exchanging glances with Hannah that spoke volumes neither woman dared utter aloud. Lily was coming back slowly in a language of her own making. Meanwhile, outside the safety of their small sanctuary, the town of Willow Creek braced itself for the storm. Whispers ran like wildfire through the market stalls and diner booths. The upcoming trial of Derek Whitmore had become a specter that loomed large over every conversation, every cautious glance toward Lily and Hannah when they ventured into town. The townsfolk were not cruel, but they were wary. It was one thing to believe in the innocence of a neighbor. It was another to confront the possibility that beneath the smiling surface of their community something terrible had been allowed to fester. At home, as the days grew colder and the evenings darker, Hannah spent long hours teaching Lily practical hand signals. They borrowed signs from American Sign Language, simple ones, yes, no, help, but wove them seamlessly into the private language Lily had built with Cooper. They practiced during walks along the misty trails behind the house. Lily bundled in a thick-knitted scarf, her hand never far from Cooper's flank. They practiced in the safety of the living room during afternoons when the fireplace crackled and the world outside their windows seemed distant and unreal. And through it all, Cooper remained the steadfast heart of their fragile universe. It was during one such twilight session with the fire sputtering low and the rain tapping softly against the windows that Lily first devised the signal that would change everything. She touched Cooper's ear gently, then pointed toward the doorway with 2 fingers. "Find danger." Hannah interpreted aloud, her voice cracking slightly. Cooper's ears flicked forward. He tilted his head, processing understanding. Hannah wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan, watching as her daughter, silent, broken, fierce, crafted a weapon out of hope and love. This was no longer just survival. This was preparation. And when the day would come when Lily and Cooper would face the man who had tried to steal everything from them, they would not stand alone. They would speak not with words, but with a language stronger than fear, a language forged in the dark and made for the light. The courtroom was a slow-breathing beast, shifting restlessly beneath the weight of what was to come. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist, wrapping Willow Creek in a gauzy shroud, as if the town itself hesitated to witness what was unfolding within its heart. Inside, the worn pews creaked under the weight of the townsfolk, their faces tight with anticipation and fear, their hands twisting handkerchiefs or gripping the worn edges of benches. At the witness stand, Lily Carter sat motionless, her small frame nearly lost beneath the oversized wooden chair. Cooper, the golden retriever, whose loyalty had long transcended mere obedience, rested at her feet. Muscles taut, amber eyes fixed on the man across the room. His golden coat, still gleaming faintly under the muted lighting, was like a beacon against the courthouse's solemn tones. Every fiber of his being was tuned to Lily's silent signals, to the language they had built together from the wreckage of fear. Across the room, Derek Whitmore sat rigid in his chair. He had aged in the weeks since his arrest, his once carefully maintained appearance beginning to crumble under the strain. His blonde hair, previously neat and precise, was now flattened with dampness, and fine lines of tension etched the corners of his mouth and eyes. He wore a charcoal suit today, but it hung looser on his frame, a silent testament to the unraveling within. His lawyer, Vincent Hale, perched beside him, flipping distractedly through papers. Vincent's usually ruddy face was pale, his spectacles slipping further down his nose with each nervous glance he cast toward the judge's bench. Judge Nathaniel Morgan, perched high above the fray, watched it all with the detached, piercing gaze of a hawk circling the battlefield. His hands were folded before him, his silver hair catching the dim light, a stark contrast to the heavy robes he wore with an old soldier's weariness. It was Jenna Collins, the prosecutor, who broke the heavy silence. She rose smoothly, her tailored navy suit. Impeccable, her voice measured as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said, "we ask permission to present new evidence critical to the understanding of the case." Judge Morgan nodded once gravely. At the back of the room, the doors opened quietly, admitting two figures whose very presence shifted the gravity of the courtroom. Sheriff Mark Ramsey entered first. His broad shoulders soaked from the lingering mist outside his uniform, though neat bore the scars of years spent battling. Not just crime, but the erosion of hope itself. His square jaw was set, his brown eyes dark with something between satisfaction and sorrow. Beside him walked Special Agent Claire Simmons, her black jacket still beaded with rain, her chestnut hair pulled into a tight bun. Claire's green eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept the room, calculating, preparing. In her hands, she carried a thin black folder, unassuming but heavy with consequence. They moved to the prosecution's table, where Jenna accepted the folder with a solemn nod. As she opened it, she revealed a series of photographs, stills, pulled from surveillance footage carefully catalogued and time-stamped. Judge Morgan gestured for her to proceed. Jenna turned to the court. The following images and testimony pertain to the recovery of Sarah Benson, a missing child presumed lost for 7 months. A collective gasp rippled through the room. In the gallery, a woman stood abruptly, a sob catching in her throat. Marla Benson. Sarah's mother had the hunched, gaunt look of a woman hollowed out by grief. Her thin frame was swaddled in a thick gray sweater several sizes too large, and her hands trembling at her sides were calloused from months of clenching and wringing. Her brown hair was streaked with gray, prematurely, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Deputy Simon Brooks, standing at the back, took an instinctive step forward, but stopped as Marla sank back into her seat, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth. Jenna continued. Sheriff Ramsey and Agent Simmons, acting on new leads, conducted a search of an abandoned property linked indirectly to the defendant. The images flashed on the screen, a dilapidated house, its paint peeled back like rotting skin, the windows boarded hastily. Inside, the camera revealed a mattress stained and torn, a chain bolted into the wall, and in the far corner a figure huddled under a thin, filthy blanket. Sarah Benson. 7 years old, her blonde hair now matted and dirty, her once rosy cheeks hollowed into sharp lines, but alive. Claire. Simmons stepped forward, her voice steady. When we found Sarah, she was dehydrated, malnourished, and terrified. She would not speak. But through simple identification methods and corroborated evidence from her belongings, we confirmed her identity. Judge Morgan nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned his steely gaze toward Derek Whitmore. Across the room, Derek shifted for the first time, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. His carefully constructed mask, built over years of predation and deceit, began to crack. Lily watched from her seat, her small fingers finding Cooper's ear. She gave a subtle, practiced squeeze, their secret signal. Cooper's body tensed immediately, his gaze sharpening, his head lifting slightly to stare at Derek. In that moment, something ancient stirred in the room. Not anger, not violence, but recognition. Predator meeting survivor. Derek's composure slipped further. A bead of sweat traced a line down his temple, despite the coldness of the room. His breathing, once slow and controlled, hitched and quickened. Cooper emitted a low, almost inaudible rumble from deep within his chest. Not a growl of threat, but one of warning, of truth. Too long ignored, Vincent Hale reached out, whispering harshly to his client, but Derek barely registered the words. His hands trembled against the table. His shoulders hunched inward, like a man shrinking under the weight of his own guilt. Jenna's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. Sarah Benson's testimony is pending, but we have her statement indicating recognition of the defendant. The room blurred at the edges for Derek. His carefully cultivated image, the respectable citizen, the mentor, the harmless neighbor, crumpled like paper in a storm. Judge Morgan leaned forward. His voice, like a stone, dropped into a still pond. Mr. Whitmore, you will have the opportunity to respond. Choose your words carefully. But Derek said nothing. He stared at Lily, at Cooper, and in that gaze all the pretense bled away, leaving only a hollow, broken thing exposed to the light. Outside, the mist began to lift from Willow Creek, revealing the battered, stubborn outlines of a town that had survived another night. Inside, the silence held heavy and absolute. The predator had been seen, and the fall had begun. The rising sun cast long, skeletal shadows through the stained glass windows of the Fair Haven courthouse, spilling fractured light onto the polished wooden floors. The mist had lifted, but a gray heaviness still hung in the air, as if the town of Willow Creek itself was bracing for the final blow. Inside, the courtroom stirred with a brittle energy. The seats filled once more with familiar faces, neighbors who had come not for spectacle but for closure, their expressions grim, their murmurs low. At the front, Judge Nathaniel Morgan presided with a stern, almost mournful air. His silver hair was neatly combed back and his dark robe hung like armor. He tapped his gavel once, the sound cracking through the tension like a starter's pistol. In the witness box, Sarah Benson sat stiffly, her small hands clutching the arms of the wooden chair. 7 years old. Sarah bore the physical scars of her ordeal in the hollowness of her cheeks and the too pale color of her skin. Her blonde hair, freshly washed but unevenly trimmed, framed her face in thin wisps. She wore a simple dress, pale yellow, and a thick gray cardigan that seemed 2 sizes too big, the sleeves covering her hands like a shield. Next to the box at a respectful distance sat Cooper. The golden retriever had been allowed to remain in the courtroom by Judge Morgan's explicit order, an unprecedented move that drew murmurs from the town's older, more traditional citizens. Cooper lay in his usual steady pose, his massive paws stretched neatly before him, his head resting lightly atop them, but his eyes never left Sarah. Sarah's mother, Marla Benson, sat in the gallery, wringing a tissue in trembling hands. A slight woman with sloping shoulders and a perpetually hunched posture, Marla's grief seemed to weigh her down physically. Her brown hair was tied back in a frayed bun, and her face, pale and lined with sleepless nights, barely managed to hold back tears as she watched her daughter prepare to speak. At the prosecutor's table, Jenna Collins stood ready. Today, she wore a deep green suit, the color muted but commanding. Her chestnut hair was pinned back, severely emphasizing the sharpness of her features. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but steady, carrying the weight of every silent plea for justice the town had ever whispered. "Sarah," Jenna said gently, "do you remember what we talked about?" Sarah nodded once, a jerky, bird-like movement. Jenna continued, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. "If at any point you feel scared or need a moment, Cooper is here for you. You can just reach out." Sarah's fingers tightened around the chair arms, but she didn't look at Jenna. Instead, her wide blue eyes found Cooper's steady, waiting gaze. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her breathing evened out. Jenna took a step closer, softening her tone even further. "Sarah, do you recognize the man sitting at the defense table?" There was a beat of silence so thick it pressed against the lungs of everyone in the room. Sarah's hands trembled beneath the sleeves of her cardigan. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Cooper shifted only slightly, but it was enough. He raised his head a fraction higher, his tail giving a single slow wag as if saying, "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." Sarah drew a shaking breath. Her small hand lifted from the chair and pointed a trembling finger, stretching out to Derek Whitmore. The defense attorney, Vincent Hale, rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly suggestive." Overruled. Judge Morgan cut in sharply, his voice brooking no argument. He turned his gaze to Sarah, softening it. "You're doing fine. Sarah, take your time." Sarah lowered her hand, her whole body sagging with the effort. Jenna moved swiftly, her voice a lifeline. "Sarah, can you tell us anything you remember about the man who kept you in that house?" Sarah's eyes fluttered closed for a moment. When they opened again, they were filled with tears that did not fall. He said not to scream." Sarah whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "He said no one would find me because no one would care." The room gasped as one, Marla Benson, broke into quiet sobs, burying her face in her hands. Cooper moved again, rising silently to his feet. He padded slowly to the side of the witness box and rested his head lightly against Sarah's knee. Sarah's fingers, still trembling, sank into the thick fur. She buried her hand there, grounding herself in his steady warmth. It was enough. With another deep, shuddering breath, Sarah looked once more at Derek Whitmore, and for the first time he flinched. The carefully constructed facade, the smooth words, the polished suits, the practiced smiles crumbled, visibly. Derek's pale blue eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. His face flushed red, then drained to a sickly gray. His hands, once clasped neatly atop the table, now clutched the edge as if to prevent himself from sliding off into some unseen abyss. Jenna spoke again, her voice cutting through the fog. "Sarah is the man you pointed to. The same man who kept you locked away." Sarah nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. Jenna turned toward Judge Morgan. "Your Honor, based on the testimony provided and the physical evidence recovered, we submit that Derek Whitmore knowingly and unlawfully kidnapped, imprisoned, and psychologically harmed minors, including Sarah Benson." Vincent Hale stood, his face grim. "My client wishes to address the court." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Judge Morgan raised an eyebrow but gestured for Derek to rise. Derek stood slowly, swaying slightly. His voice, when it came, was stripped of the veneer that had carried him so far. His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, looking at no one. "I plead guilty." The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once, a collective sigh of shock, of sorrow, of bitter relief. Marla Benson collapsed against the shoulder of the woman beside her, a neighbor, a stranger, it hardly mattered. Tears flowed freely now, washing away months of horror. Sarah buried her face against Cooper's side, her small shoulders shaking with the release of a weight far too heavy for a child to bear. And across the room, Lily Carter watched it all unfold with wide, solemn eyes. Her hand found Cooper's leash again, squeezing once an old signal. A quiet message. "Thank you." Judge Morgan's gavel came down, once final and thunderous. Justice had not erased the scars, but today it had given them meaning, and for the first time in a long, long while, Willow Creek began to heal. The winter sun rose timidly over Willow Creek, painting the town in fragile shades of gold and soft blue. The mist that had so often cloaked the mornings was gone, burned away by the tentative warmth of a new day. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, cleaner, as if some great invisible weight had been lifted from the hearts of the people. At the Fairhaven courthouse, final proceedings wrapped up quietly without spectacle. Derek Whitmore, once the town's proud son, now a fallen shadow of the man he pretended to be, was led away in handcuffs, the iron clinking a stark counterpoint to the muffled weeping and the murmur of prayers whispered under breath. His sentencing had been swift and absolute life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No appeals, no second chances. The gavel of Judge Nathaniel Morgan had fallen with the force of a long-awaited judgment, echoing in the silence like a closing door. Outside, townsfolk gathered in small clusters, coats buttoned tight against the chill, their faces pale but lighter than before. Sheriff Mark Ramsey stood near the courthouse steps, arms crossed over his broad chest, his uniform crisp, despite the long hours. His weathered face, so often a mask of stoic resolve, now carried a shadow of weary satisfaction. Nearby, Special Agent Claire Simmons leaned casually against a lamppost, her black jacket open to the cool air, her green eyes surveying the crowd with quiet vigilance. Even in victory, she trusted nothing to chance, a habit formed long ago and hardened by scars unseen. In the center of it all stood Hannah Carter, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for the first time in what felt like years. She wore a thick, cream-colored sweater, simple jeans and boots dusted with frost. Her brown eyes, once shadowed with exhaustion, now glimmered with something delicate and precious. Hope, Lily Carter, stood by her side, bundled in a puffy navy coat with a knitted pink scarf wrapped twice around her neck. The little girl's hand was firmly entwined in Cooper's leash. Cooper, ever vigilant, sat proudly at attention, his thick golden coat catching the morning sun, his amber eyes scanning the faces around them with quiet dignity. The town watched them, the mother, the daughter, and the golden sentinel who had refused to let the darkness have its way. And they saw at last not victims but survivors. Mayor Jonathan Reed, a portly man with a gray mustache and kind brown eyes, made his way through the crowd. In his early 60s, Reed had been Willow Creek's mayor for almost a decade, known for his steady leadership and deep roots in the community. He wore a dark green parka and a battered wool cap, his gloved hands holding a manila folder. Reaching Hannah and Lily, he removed his cap respectfully. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Miss Lily, on behalf of the town, we owe you a debt we can never repay." Hannah shook her head, tears already welling. "We didn't do it alone." Mayor Reed smiled softly and crouched down his knees, creaking audibly until he was eye level with Lily. "And neither should any child have to," he said warmly. He extended the folder to Hannah, who accepted it with trembling hands. Inside was the official charter for a new town initiative, Cooper's Hope Home. A large Victorian house on the edge of Willow Creek, once abandoned and forgotten, had been purchased and would be renovated into a sanctuary for children who had survived trauma. An idea born not just of necessity but of a deep collective yearning to heal what had been broken. The funds had come from unexpected places. Small donations left anonymously at the mayor's office, fundraisers at the church and the town hall, and a quiet but sizable grant from an out-of-town foundation that had followed the trial closely. The people of Willow Creek, once hesitant and guarded, had opened their wallets and their hearts. Lily's fingers tightened on Cooper's leash, and for a moment she simply stared up at the towering courthouse, the place where she had once trembled in silence. Then, with a small tug on Cooper's collar, she stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path to the courthouse steps. Lily moved slowly, her boots crunching softly against the thin layer of frost. Cooper matching her stride for stride. Halfway up the steps, she stopped. The town held its breath. Lily turned her blue eyes luminous under the pale sun and faced the crowd. Her free hand released the leash and reached down to cup Cooper's face. her small fingers sinking into his thick fur. And then, for the first time in many long, painful months, her voice clear and high and beautiful rose into the morning air. "Thank you, Cooper," she said. The words were simple, but they rippled through the crowd like a warm wind, thawing something that had been frozen too long. Tears streamed openly now, not just from Hannah, but from men and women who had believed themselves long past the point of weeping. Sheriff Ramsey cleared his throat gruffly. Even Judge Morgan, visible through the courthouse window, bowed his head for a moment, his lined face softening. Cooper, for his part, merely thumped his tail once against the stone step, his eyes half closing in a gesture of contentment and acceptance. The moment broke when Lily laughed a bright, startled sound, as if it had surprised even her. Cooper barked once a joyful noise, and the crowd, freed, at last erupted into applause and cheers. Later that afternoon, as workers began clearing brush around the old Victorian house that would become Cooper's Hope home, Hannah and Lily sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the meadow beyond town. The sun was dipping low, setting the fields ablaze with light. Lily rested her head against Hannah's side, her body relaxing into her mother's embrace. For the first time in a long time, Cooper lay stretched at their feet, his tail wagging lazily, whenever a gust of wind sent leaves skittering past. It was not a perfect ending. Scars would remain, memories would linger. Healing, Hannah knew, was a journey, not a destination. But as she looked down at her daughter smiling, breathing, beginning again, she understood something deeper than words. They had won, not through anger or vengeance or even through law, but through love. Through the unwavering loyalty of a golden dog with patient eyes and a steadfast heart. And in the town of Willow Creek, under a sky washed clean by rain and courage, a new sun rose. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not wrapped in thunder or blinding light, but hidden in the quiet courage of a small child, the steady heartbeat of a faithful dog, and the unwavering love that refuses to give up. Through Lily and Cooper, we are reminded that healing is possible even after the darkest storms. We are reminded that God often sends his angels not with wings, but with golden fur and patient eyes, that hope, though fragile, can be stronger than fear when we choose to believe in it. In our everyday lives, we may not always see the battles others are fighting. We may not always hear the silent cries for help, but we can choose to be the kindness that someone needs. We can choose to be the hand that steadies the voice that comforts the heart that forgives. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles are real. Comment below with Amen if you believe that God still works his wonders through the smallest and quietest of moments. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of hope, courage, and healing. Together, let us lift each other higher. May God bless and protect each one of you who reads these words. Amen.